Well, welcome everyone. I'm going to get started right on time, which is unusual for me, but happy to do it. My name's Tony Woodlief. I'm with State Policy Network. Primarily, I work in our Center for Practical Federalism, which is, I guess, why I'm here. We want to talk about how to make federalism practical. And I'm not going to do much to introduce the panelists here because you have their bios and we have limited time. So I'm gonna ask some questions and they're gonna speak for a few minutes and we're gonna wrap up with time for Q&A. So save up the really hard questions for the panelists and I'll take the easy ones. So the Center for Practical Federalism, the whole goal there is to try to engage state and local elected officials in combating federal overreach. And so some friends have asked me, well, you had the turnover in Congress, things are different now. Do you really need to worry about this anymore? The answer, fortunately for us, is yes. We think that it's going to be imperative still to try to defend federalism. And why do we do it from the states? Well, our point of view is you've had this, systematic erosion, or I would say even destruction, deliberate destruction of many of the important components of a functioning Congress. You have 2.1 million civilian federal employees spread across who knows how many agencies, let's say 400. I think if Elon's new commission can just tell us how many agencies and sub-agencies are, that'll be a victory. And then you've got 535 members of Congress and maybe 19,000 staffers all in. Even if they were all devoted to oversight, which they are not, they would be outnumbered. On the other hand, you have 520,000 state and local elected officials, all of whom have some authority to investigate federal agencies, to oppose, to raise hell about, to obstruct, to even refuse to comply with illegal federal directives. And so part of our goal is to build a set of tools to make them aware of how federal agencies are influencing their state operations and just get them energized about doing something about it. And so with that kind of little preamble, I'd first like to turn to our speaker, Cameron Sexton from the Tennessee House, who I think has firsthand experience with dealing with federal agencies and how they reach into communities in your state. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, thank you. It's great to be here. Thank you all for coming in today. Look, I think when you look at it, when you go back to the beginning, the articles of that were established early was more state power than federal power, and the Constitution was more shared power. I think what happens over time with anything, you go any state, any federal government, what happens is the bureaucracy starts trying to take over from that aspect, and the bureaucracy becomes the power of the federal government or of the states if you're not careful. And so with that comes other things into your state. And I think prime examples for us is, there was education's one. So couple of states were trying to improve the testing requirements, provide more accountability in their states for testing third and fourth graders and so forth. The federal government sent back to them and saying that they couldn't make stronger accountability issues in those states. In Tennessee, we tried to put forth an idea that said we wanted to forego federal education dollars and go do something. And there's pushback from the federal government on that as well. And so then you look at Obamacare, when they were trying to expand Obamacare in our states. I actually came up to Washington, D.C. with CMS to try to negotiate something that was different than what other people were doing. And I think when you talk about state sovereignty, each state is uniquely different from one another. We're not all the same. We all have maybe a same issue, a health issue, but how we want to address it is completely different. And it became very aware to me when we came up that they didn't really care about the state's uniqueness. They just wanted their overall arching goal. And there was nothing that you could say, do, or otherwise to accomplish that goal. Although they would allow a couple states to do a couple things, they would come back later and say, well, you couldn't do what Indiana did because we're not going to allow that anymore. And that was the bureaucracy trying to tell the 50 states, this is how you're going to do it. And in some instances, that's correct. I get it with military and other things that they're trying to do. I get that. But there's other states where it's supposed to be a shared power. And what you have is a competing headbutting constantly between the two. And we spent a lot of time in Tennessee talking about how do we get our state sovereignty back. And look, we can go to court all the time, which is what we do a lot. We do a lot pushing back. We have a great state AG who does push back with other state AGs to try to protect our state's rights from overreaching bureaucracy. But the number one thing is, and I'll end on this, is I'm a parent. I have two kids who are both in their 20s. They're both out of college. They're both working. I have a 10-year-old. a success as a parent is when they come off your payroll, correct? Isn't that right? When they come off your payroll, that's a successful parent because they are able to do what they need to. Now, if they were on my payroll and I was giving them money to buy groceries, I want them to buy 2% milk, not this fancy organic almond milk, right? I don't want to pay $12 for milk. I want you to get the normal. Well, today it's probably $12 for normal milk. But anyway, that's a whole different conversation down that way. But look, what states need to do is realize that we can't continue to take federal money. That is the end all, the be all. That is the last way that the bureaucracy in the federal government tries to dictate to the state what we can and can't do. Because when you propose policy, the first thing they will threaten when they don't like it is to remove that money. If they don't have that entitlement on you over the money, then you are more free to do what you want to because that takes their number one whip away from them. And so I think that's where the states need to get to. It's very hard. You're looking at billions of dollars for education in Tennessee. That's I think it was $1.3 billion to do that, but we could afford it. But somebody has to start the process. Somebody has to start pushing back because you're never going to win against the bureaucracy if you're continuing to take the money.
You know, that reminded me, I was reading this paper by, I want to say James Kogan. He's out at Hoover, economist. And so he's run all these numbers, and what he asked was, gosh, what if we just imagine the federal budget today, but let's call it the Madisonian budget, meaning what if it only spent money on the powers enumerated for the federal government in the Constitution, but for the sake of argument, we'll also throw in Social Security and Medicare, and in part because those are supposed to be kind of self-funding programs. And what he shows is that since 1950, you've had this expansive growth, of course, into areas that were once reserved for states, localities, private sector. And he shows that the entirety plus some of our current debt is because of the expansion into those areas. And so then you could see the connection. The more the federal government gets into telling the states what to do, and then of course providing the money to induce them to do it, we get into this current problem. And I'm wondering, Speaker Sexton, do you have any examples you want to share? It's okay if you don't, but of where you've seen the money come with obligations, expectations that are contrary to the interests of the people of Tennessee?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're all overboard. I think what they're very good at, though, is they're very good at hiding what that is. And so when we were going through our not take education dollars from the federal government and fund it ourselves, we started looking at what the bureaucracy in the federal government does is they send the rules down. So we have a government operations committee. Y'all can call it whatever if you're legislators, a rules committee that looks at all these things that come in. And what the federal government would tell our Department of Education is, here's some rules that you all need to adopt or you're not going to get the money. So when you dive in, it really looks like the state is imposing it on itself, but really it's the federal government using the states to impose it on themselves. And so that's one instance. And so they do that all the time. And so education is one, go back to road money back in the day. Now we can all agree that lowering the blood alcohol content for a DUI was a good thing from 0.1 to 0.08. But states did not want to do that at that time, and they used the federal road money to force them to drop that. Whether you agree that was good or bad, that was what they were doing, and that's what they do all the time. Education is an example. Our Medicaid program is another example. If you don't do it the way they want to, they're going to tell you that they're going to withhold money or they're going to do X, Y, Z. But they're very good at hiding it. And so the only way in Tennessee, we've only had Republicans in majorities for 14 years. 150 years prior was all Democrat majority for our state. We would have, every now and then, we'd have a pop of Republican in there. But in 14 years, we've done more to reduce regulations, reduce rules, empower the people, empower businesses to become successful, cut taxes, and do everything, and our economy is thriving. But the one problem we still have is within the bureaucracy, because you have 30 years of Democrat bureaucracy still left. And so our battle in our state is battling the bureaucracy, and we need more time. And in federal government, I'm hoping that President Trump, when he comes in, if he does do away with the Department of Education, which I think we should, because anything passed by Jimmy Carter shouldn't still be in place. But if we should, then I hope that they remove those mandates and they remove the restrictions on that money coming down. You can get rid of the Department of Education. That just frees up more money. But if you do not move the regulations and restrictions, we don't have anything different than what we had before.
All right, thank you. So Steve Johnson, the next gentleman here, he's my colleague at the Center for Practical Federalism, former lawmaker from Michigan who chaired their House Oversight Committee. So he was also in a position to see how agencies can behave and misbehave. But Steve, do you want to talk a little bit about our scorecard and some of your work related to that?
Yes, I do. So I think a lot of people think that maybe lawmakers don't actually like federalism. At the state level, they really do. They oftentimes just don't know what can I do about it, though. Federal money is a huge thing. So I'll tell a quick story. I was elected in 2016, brand new. I don't know anything. I'm still learning things. But I like federalism, right? And this was in light of the Flint water crisis. The federal government had said, hey, we're going to give some money to Flint. But the state legislature, we had to appropriate those dollars. Well, being the federalism champion I am, I see federal money for a local water system. That's not their role. We shouldn't be doing that. I voted no on that. I was the only no vote. I get all this hate mail that comes towards me. You're not going to just be able to say no to all these federal dollars. Like, that's a really tough thing to do. And hopefully someday we can kind of shift that mindset to get there. But that's not going to be the first step. And so we'd work on this scorecard, say, what are some other things that lawmakers can do that are very practical, that isn't going to lose you your next election, that makes sense? And a lot of it is really reining in the administrative state. Federal bureaucrats love to call state bureaucrats and say, here, we want you to do X, Y, and Z. What we've said is we want to make sure that your state legislature is very active in what's going on in your rules, your regulations. What is the federal government telling your agencies? I mean, Tennessee, you guys passed a great bill this year that said anything the Tennessee Department of Education receives from the feds, any guidance, you have to tell us, because we want to know, what are they telling you? And then one final thing, I love to talk about this. Our scorecard is not really red state versus blue state. There's this really weird mix there, and there's this Oregon law. You wouldn't think Oregon would be sort of a champion, right? It deals with legislative oversight of federal funding. Oregon, they're the only state to do this. They have a process where before a state agency can apply for a grant, so not spending the money, but before they can even apply for it, they have to go to the legislature and get permission. And I've watched the hearing. I actually talked to the chairwoman of the committee, lefty from Portland. We probably couldn't be further apart politically. And yet they have a great process. I watched it. They're asking great questions. They say, so what's the maintenance of effort? What is this going to cost us? What rules or regulations do we have to do to adopt this? Now, it's Oregon. They never say no to the money. That's not surprising. But they actually have a process where they're starting to look at those things and ask those questions. And I start to think, well, shoot, what if we had more friendly states doing this? We might start to have a process where we know what the strings attached are. We know what they're telling them. And they might start to say, thanks, but no thanks. We don't need this grant. So that's just, there's a number of different ideas out there before you have to say no. And I'd love to say no to a lot of that money, but there's other things they can do that won't lose you your next election.
Steve, could you talk a little bit, you mentioned guidance. Can you say a little bit about that and what you found when you talk with lawmakers in particular about the nature of guidance?
Yeah, so guidance is not law. That's the first thing. Very simple. Think of like a Dear Colleague letter. Agencies, they send this letter, and guidance usually is very benign. Federal law is very complicated. Rules are complicated. What am I supposed to do? Here's a letter. It spells it out. The problem is agencies have taken maybe some liberties with this and have started to add things that aren't in law. Well, you can imagine a state agency getting this letter from a federal agency and says, hey, you should do X, Y, and Z. I don't want to lose my job. They tell me to do this. I'm just going to do it. But they don't have to. And so at the center, you guys have started to find, here's some things that the feds are telling states to do, and you don't have to. And I'll give you an example. Medicaid, federal program, the states run it. They sent a letter that said, in your Medicaid offices, your welfare offices, your call centers, you have to have interpreters for the top 15 non-English languages spoken in your state. Well, that's nowhere in law. In fact, we looked, it's not required whatsoever. But every state generally just, they see that and they do that. So in Michigan, we had a lawmaker, they sent a letter to their DHHS and said, are we doing this and what's the cost? And the administration said, yep, we're doing it. It costs over $1 million. Well, they don't have to do that. Now, they can decide to do that. They can say, we think this makes good sense. Or they could say 15 doesn't make a lot of sense, but maybe they're the top 4 languages in our state. every state is different, right? And so there's a lot of these things that is out there that you don't necessarily have to do. The problem is we don't see all those guidance documents. And that's where the Tennessee law said, all right, you've got to start telling us about this so we can flag when there's a problem and tell you, don't be doing that.
That's good. You mentioned as well maintenance of effort, and so one of the things in the scorecard, and we have a new edition coming out soon with new data. The states' rankings have changed, so you should check that out. And Jonathan Wolfson's here somewhere. Our partners at Cicero, they give us a lot of good data for that. One of the things we look at that we think is important as we think about what should states do to protect and maybe even extend federalism, protect their sovereignty, is look at the true costs of the federal grants. Because there's, these are gushers of money pouring into the states, and they all have strings, but they also all require expenditure. And one of the things, State Policy Network, it's a group of state-based think tanks. So one of our partners in Wisconsin looked at this a few years ago, and they just looked at their state Department of Education, and they wanted to know how many people have they hired with federal money. And they found in their Department of Education, it was over half of the non-teaching personnel were hired with federal grants. And then they asked, well, what are they doing every day? And mostly what they were doing is trying to get more federal grants so they can hire more people, right? And so then the impact on your long-term impact on your state pension obligations, and we know at this point, what is it, a $4.5 trillion unfunded kind of mass liability state by state. It's a looming disaster, and we know those states will start to come to the federal government for bailouts, but they don't look at the total costs when they take the money. And so one of the things we urge states to do is, like, you can still take the money, but please acknowledge that a dollar is not necessarily a dollar. Maybe once you add up the costs, it's 70 cents or 50 cents. Maybe it's not worth it. Or maybe you, like Speaker Sexton is saying, maybe we need to figure out how do we generate our own revenue and do these things ourselves so we have more control. So that's part of the thing in the scorecard you can look at. Speaker Sexton, do you have any responses to what you've heard from Steve so far?
No, I mean, I agree with him. Look, my kids didn't become independent in 2 years. It took 25. So, it's going to take time to come off the government payroll. It really is. And there's things that you can do. Love the Oregon aspect. I was already thinking here, Representative Todd's here from Tennessee, Luke's here, who's works for Senate Majority Leader Jack Johnson. That could be something we could put in fiscal review, which would be where they look at all the government contracts that are coming in and what we're doing or not doing. It'd be a great aspect to put in there. Look, I mean, you look at it, and the Department of Education is very good at it. And when I talk to superintendents, if you want to get to the grants and they get these federal grants, they are told that they need to hire somebody to administer it. And that's just what they do. It's about adding people to your payroll, which does increase your expenses. And so it's very unique. I'll give you an example. Tennessee State University is going through a tough financial time in our state. Basically, they're bankrupt due to the mismanagement of the leadership were there. And what they did is they took, you'll find this interesting, they took all this federal money 2 years ago and put it towards scholarships for students, which would seem like a great thing. But what they didn't account for is the increased expenses that they needed to cover all those new students, 2,000 new students. And then what they didn't realize is the next year they're going to need all that money again to pay for those students to come the second year and the third year. So what happened? Enrollment dropped. And so they staffed up, they're over, they're down. And so that one decision without knowing what those grants were going to cost them in the future or even recognizing it is a prime example of how entities get in trouble. And then they turn around and they're trying to figure out how to raise tuition. They're trying to figure out how to raise this, and they're not doing the work on the front end. And I think that's what he was talking about. So if you do it on the front end, it saves you a lot on the return.
My colleague Jennifer Butler here, maybe you'll have a comment in the Q&A, but she's looking at all the ways that the COVID bailout money that's gone to states. One thing we see is, gosh, they hired people as if they didn't know the money would stop. And so now there's going to be a crisis. Oh, we have to keep paying them. Oh, what do we do? So, all right, well, one thing we wanted to get across is that defending federalism, advancing federalism, it's not simply a negativity. It's not simply a matter of, gosh, how do we keep these federal agencies out of our communities? But there's also a lot of building that needs to happen, a lot of cultivation. It's a positive thing, a restorative thing. And so at the end here, we have John Hood, who's with the John William Pope Foundation, also on the State Policy Network board. I've known John gosh, a long time. He was my editor at one point, which was painful, but necessary. So John, could you talk about some of the things y'all are doing in North Carolina on the restorative side to build up the institutions that are necessary for federalism to actually work?
So I'm not a current or former legislator. I'm completely unelectable. But I have been spending now many decades training people who would one day be in these kinds of positions to analyze and potentially reject or accept with conditions federal funds, including the incoming Speaker of the North Carolina House of Representatives, one of my trainees, the head of the university system, the head of the government operations staff that staffs the GovOps committee, mayors, county leaders, people who aren't necessarily in public office, but who have a lot of influence over people in public office. And why do we spend all this time and effort training? I have 3 or 4 different programs that I help to run. It's because federalism isn't just an abstraction. We were talking about abstractions earlier in the discussion about the election cycle, but it's also true on this issue. We have great ideas. We have principles in the Constitution. We have institutions and legal standards at the state level. We have processes, and none of that matters if you don't have the right people in a position to ask the questions and make those processes work. Another analogy for federalism, for federal money, is of course that it's an addiction. It's like a drug. It feels good in the short run. It has all these bad effects later. And one of the bad effects, the people used to shake your finger at you about certain addictions and say it'll stunt your growth, right? But in fact, federalism, or the lack of federalism, federal power, federal funding has stunted the growth. It has made the muscles of federalism atrophy at the state and local level, and we've got to build those muscles up. Some of that involves training people how to serve, how to run for office. First of all, that's one of my programs, but then how to serve in office, how to ask tough questions, literally how to run committee meetings. Use a little bit, understand Robert's Rules of Order. Understand what information in your state or your locality is public information, how much of it is shielded from public view, what are the criteria that allow that to happen, typically personnel and negotiating certain real estate transactions, that sort of thing. The limitations are usually and properly narrow. How do you jaw that loose if you're not in office? How do you release information? How do you release information strategically? And how do you build relationships, not just among your own colleagues, obviously that's essential in your own caucus, in your own level of government, but build relationships across lines of difference. One of the programs I help to run is called the North Carolina Leadership Forum. This is not a training program for people who want to be leaders one day. It's a gathering, it's a convening of people who are already leaders. And we lean into having Democrats and Republicans, people from federal, state, and local government, people from the private sector, people from law, people from religious congregations, people from chambers of commerce and civic organizations, because those are all part of the process that makes government work at the state and local level, helping them understand difference is not a problem. Disagreements are inevitable. Human nature mandates them. It's how we handle those disagreements. And particularly if you're on the beat, if you're like Steve was and you're on the beat of trying to detect all of these underappreciated consequences of addiction to federal funding, you can't just rely on people who share your same party affiliation. You can't just rely on people who are on the same committee you are. You need other kinds of allies. We've seen on numerous occasions effective coalitions between people on the right, people on the left, lawmakers working with local officials, state lawmakers working with federal officials, working with their congressional delegation on some of these questions of federal power. There was actually some of that going on, as you were talking about, Mr. Speaker, about the use of highway funding to compel states to change their blood alcohol levels for driving under the influence. There was some effective pushback in some other areas of transportation funding, and it didn't happen just because state officials properly asked or good questions or pushed back. It's because they work with their federal lawmakers to push back and try to get laws changed, try to get, in the case of friendly administrations, try to get those administrations changed. We've been talking a lot already today, this morning, about the incoming new administration and the implications for many policies that we all care about. This is obviously one of them, federalism. I heard some people whispering in the room in there about, well, at least when the new Trump administration comes in, we're not going to have to worry about. I'm afraid that's true in some cases and is not going to be true in others, because previous Republican administrations, previous Democratic administrations, they may have flexed different muscles. They may have tried to impose different priorities on states and localities, but they all did it to some degree, and we should expect the new administration not to be different in that behavior. They might have different subject matter. We're still going to have to empower our state and local officials to defend federalism. It isn't going to be defended just in court. It isn't going to be defended by op-eds. It isn't going to be defended, no offense to myself or anybody here, it's not going to be defended just by panels at Washington conferences. It's got to be defended by people, by mayors and county leaders and school board leaders and state lawmakers and leaders and governors and attorney generals who know what they're doing. Don't just have the right ideas, but have been trained, have experience, have been mentored by others who know how to run these committees, not to be outwitted by the bureaucrats who've been there for 20 years. The lawmaker may have been there for 4 years. How do you avoid that mistake? Part of the solution, I'm convinced, is to build and cultivate a strong network of leaders, starting when people are in college, when they're right out of college, getting them into their first jobs, getting them into their second jobs, creating mentorship opportunities so that these muscles that we have to flex at the state and local level are strong enough to resist that federal drug.
So, John, thank you for that. One of the things you mentioned, you're talking about being able to run committees and do that kind of work of government. So, Steve, obviously, that made me think of your work trying to evangelize oversight. So, could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I chaired the oversight in Michigan. It's not a great honor. It's actually no one else wanted it. That's the only reason I got the committee chair. Oversight's hard work. It's not as fun as passing a bill. It's not as fun as getting good lobbyist checks. I mean, it's just, hey, what is this agency doing? And asking lots of questions, doing lots of follow-up. But it's necessary. And so that's one of the things that we try to impart to state and local officials is your job isn't just passing legislation. It's asking tough questions and making agencies answer for it. Because if you don't know what's going on inside your agencies, you're not actually doing a good job of fighting the federal government. Doesn't matter how good your bills are. You have to know, what is your Health and Human Services doing? What communication are they having with the feds? Doesn't mean it's all bad, but you have to understand, what does that look like? Education, I mean, that's a huge thing. I mean, you guys had a great working group on the federal funding, and there's a lot of people that just didn't know, well, what are these strings? What is going on? And it was a great practice of beginning that exercise to say, all right, how does the federal government interact with our Department of Education? What rules and stuff do they lay down? How can we maybe start to push back? And so it's not easy. It's not always the most fun thing to do. It's not always the best for raising money. But oversight is really a really important part of lawmaking. And so that's something that we're trying to get across to lawmakers. Doesn't matter how many bills you introduce or pass. What are you asking your agencies? Are you really digging in to see what's going on inside state government?
So, and Speaker Sexton, I wonder if you could speak to, sort of related to this, to the oversight and dealing with federal agencies. You mentioned Skermeti and his team, the AG's office, wonderful AG, and a great team that they put together specifically to deal with federal agencies. And I wonder if could you talk a little bit about, maybe in Tennessee, but more broadly, like how important is it for lawmakers who are concerned about federalism to be in communication with, coordination with their AGs and maybe even other officials in the state?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what we learned through COVID, if you go back and look, I think that what happened is all the Republican Governor Association started working together towards protecting the interests of their states. And what you saw is them standing together, planning and looking to see how they're going to address and how they're going to protect their sovereignty. And I think that was the first step in COVID. I think the other thing is, with me, I speak to other speakers in the state. So I have a good, in the country, Speaker Smith in South Carolina and others. And I'll give you one example of BEAD money coming from the federal government for internet broadband. And the federal government knows that they can't put price caps on it. So what they did is through their grant is said, if you're going to apply, you need to have a price cap in your grant. Once again, it's not the federal government that's doing it because they know they can't, but they're forcing the states to do something that they want. And in order to get the grant supposedly, or a scoring of the grant, you had to put in a cap. And so we were adamantly opposed to it. And I had conversations with multiple speakers, Oklahoma and all over the country, talking about, let's make sure that our departments, our state, doesn't submit applications that have a cap in it. And let's just see what the federal government will do and move from there. But those are real life examples that go so far under the radar that you really don't know. And that's where, look, I would much rather deal with grants from the federal government, because at least you know what's in it if you dig enough or be able to, than just direct funding. In education, direct funding, if you look at Title IX, that is where they hold you accountable for basically education dollars. If you take any amount of money, you have to abide by Title IX. And that was the big fight this last year, was what were they trying to add into Title IX? And so working with other states as they hear things, and the speakers in other states hear things, and us going to conferences, it allows us to have that communication to come back and talk to, it was our Economic Community Development Department, and saying, can you tell me about the BEAD grant? Are they requiring this of us? Is this what they're wanting? And having us push back on our own departments and try to create this seal. And guess what? A couple of states didn't put in a cap. And you know what happened? They still got the grant money, right? But some states put in the cap, which goes against the interest a lot of times. And so all of a sudden you can start seeing, really, with the communication and in today's world, you can really see that most of the times what they're trying to get you to do, they're not going to hold the line on, because they know they can't. But they're going to try to snooker you into doing it.
That's great. I ran across a Yale Law Review article from a few years ago. It's by a fairly liberal professor at Yale. I know that's hard to believe. There are some. And her point was that she was complaining that federal agencies don't withdraw the money enough to punish the states when the states are not compliant. And I made a bunch of copies. Like, okay, we got to hand that out to every lawmaker we meet. Like, here they are. They're giving it away. They're complaining. So I think that's a great point. And Steve, that made me think, Speaker Sexton's points about the grants made me think of your interesting observation in Utah and your communication with some folks there about some of the grants that their state agencies were writing to try to get federal funds.
Yeah, so the Inflation Reduction Act, which is really the Green New Deal, lots of money to states for green projects, and we could see a lot of usually conservative-minded states were submitting all this very green energy proposals to try to get federal money. Utah was saying, hey, we'll give everyone electric lawnmowers. South Carolina, I like to talk about them the most. They were actually advocating for more plant-based meals in schools and nursing homes. So the land of barbecue was willing to throw meat under the bus to try to get a couple more federal dollars. But as Speaker says, the federal government, if you just push back a little bit, they actually usually will let you. But so often we got to get every dollar, and we're so worried about just putting the slightest bit of opposition that we just sort of fall into whatever the feds say. If you just sort of say, no, we're not going to do that. This is what the law says. We're going to go ahead and do this anyways. The feds, they cave most of the time.
So John Hood, I need to let you respond to the land of barbecue comment.
In South Carolina, they put mustard on it. That's not barbecue. Well, part of the basic problem here, as we were talking about earlier, is the incentive structure. How just what you were just talking about, Steve. The people who were trying to maximize federal funds, they perceive that to be their job. And it may very well be their job, because it may be how they're evaluated. And it could very well be that, set aside what people say and their votes on other matters, they could be as fiscally conservative sounding as you can imagine. When it comes right down to it, if they get a federal dollar so they don't have to raise a state dollar with a tax increase, so they can use federal money to, in the short run, pay for things like people did with COVID money, and then do tax cuts, that feels really good. Again, this takes us back to this feeling, this rush of you're on the drug, you've just taken your dose, and it feels really great. If we don't figure out a way to change the incentive structure, and then we also don't figure out a way to get more people in these positions where they're in the bureaucracy or lawmakers overseeing them, to where they have the ability and the interest to do a better job, we're just going to keep talking about it, and it's going to keep happening. It's very simple. I know there are people, I know people who think this conversation is naive, because never will a government bureaucrat or somebody who runs a committee or someone's on the appropriations process of state legislature will ever turn down significant amounts of federal money, because the incentives are all the wrong way. I think they're mistaken, but that is how they feel, and we've got to give them a better sense that it can be done, it has been done, people are prepared to do it effectively, and that we should be rewarding legislative staffers and administrative staffers not according to how much federal money they maximize, but something like the opposite. Change the, you treasure what you measure, and you measure what you treasure. And if we don't think about changing the incentive structure so that that is not considered to be a success when you get more money out of Washington, then we're going to have a lot of continuing problems.
So I'm going to open it up to Q&A, but first I'll make this observation. Just looking at the data on federal funds to states, if you back it up to 1990, which, as I mentioned earlier, I think that's a good marker for when Congress really began to deteriorate in terms of its capacity to oversee federal agencies. So mark it there, 1990, and then you look at the trajectory of growth in percent of state spending that comes from federal agencies. You're headed to a point whereby, if everything stayed the same on that trajectory, by 2045, the average state will get over half of its funding from federal agencies. And so we're talking about the slow motion destruction of self-governance. And so something has to be altered, unless we want people in this city to tell us how to live in our homes, which I don't think
that number
we do.
now is what, like a third or almost 40%?
It's 36%. I mean, it's a little weird because of all the COVID stuff, right? So you got to let some of that settle. But it was, well, I think they just released the numbers October 31st, which is fitting. So I'd have to look at the new average. But usually what happens since 2000, anytime you have a crisis, federal agencies flood states with money, and then you have a new plateau. You never settle back down to the prior amount. So that's just the new ratchet effect. So with all that blabbing, sorry. Any questions or challenges for the panelists? Yes, sir.
I have a simple question. Would one or all of you define federalism for me, please?
One or all of us define federalism. Well, don't take that from John Hood, because he's going to define federalism for us.
Well, it really has to do with the distribution of federal, state, and local responsibilities. As was discussed earlier, the U.S. Constitution, the idea was you were going to delegate powers to Article 1. You could delegate powers to Congress. Obviously, some powers are delegated to the presidency, but most of them to Congress. And then there was this part at the end that became the elastic clause and all the things that are necessary and proper to carry it out. That was not the purpose of that clause, as we know. But what had happened over time is things that were reserved for state or local action have been taken over by the feds. Admittedly, the term federalism is a bit of a challenge, because on the one hand we say federal power is bad and federalism is good, because what we mean is a sort of confederalism, the distribution of powers. That's why I don't even like the term states' rights. States have powers. Individuals have rights. Different governments have powers. At the state level, you have a general police power. The federal government doesn't have that. The federal government should only be able to do things it is specifically authorized to do in the Constitution. States, and depending upon the relationship between states and localities, sometimes localities have a sort of an inherent police power and have more discretion. That doesn't mean they should abuse it. The federal government is not supposed to have the discretion. It's been reversed. Not only does the federal government have plenty of discretion, but they've been taking away the discretion of states and localities. That's really the point of this panel.
Was that sufficient, or do you want more? Good. Okay. All right. Thank you, John. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so the question is the new department that President Trump is putting in about efficiency, it would look at a lot of this stuff. We agree. I believe we would all agree with that. The other thing is, how does the state work with the locals, and do we act like the federal government to the locals, is the nutshell. And I'll admit, sometimes we do. Yes, I mean, it's just the way it is sometimes. But I will say, I think that the thing to remember, though, is in Tennessee, we set up all of our local governments. We're the overseer. And so we see our General Assembly as the overseer of the local governments. And so what we do is we do pass statutes and we do other things to set the parameters within how they're supposed to work and what they're supposed to do. And so And a lot of times it comes down to Second Amendment rights and other things where in Tennessee we may be a little different than some of our local governments. So we see our role as overseers. We haven't had as much battle. You have a lot of times the locals will say, oh, you're trying to treat me like the federal government's treating you. And that's usually when there's a difference of opinion. But we don't really ever go through with money trying to dictate a lot of different stuff locally done. As long as you're staying within the ability of the state constitution and within the statutes that are passed, we don't really move in that direction. The issues that we've had with Davidson County in the past is when they were trying to put DEI into grants, city grants to go to businesses and do that sort of stuff. We did push back on that sort of stuff. So we see ourselves more as the overviewer of what's happening local, but we do have issues where we do butt heads. Yes.
Other questions? Yes, sir. In the tan, and then you. So the question is, what can people in the states do to work with the federal government to cut the strings? And you can go ahead, Steve, and if you have anything to say, then I'm going to give you the mic.
There's probably a lot of different ideas. What I would start with is everyone talks about strings. Everyone believes there's strings, but no one actually knows what those strings are. So I go back to oversight and say, if you're a state lawmaker and you want less strings, put to the forefront what those strings are. Highlight for everyone, say, look, the feds are saying in order to take these education dollars, we now must do X, Y, and Z, and that's a really bad idea. The more you can elevate that, the easier it is to go to your colleagues in D.C. and say, knock it off. Most of them don't understand what the strings are. I mean, that is the problem, is everyone understands they're strings, they're bad, we don't like it, but like, what exactly is it? And so I think that's the first step, is we've got to highlight that. So I always go to oversight.
So the gentleman in the hat, well, you're not wearing the hat, but it's right there. So could you put the hat on while you ask the question? No, I'm kidding.
Did you want Jennifer to give a quick?
Oh, do you? I'm sorry, Jen. Yeah, please.
Just really quick, I've been thinking a lot about this Doge opportunity. I think there's 4 steps that we could recommend to Elon and the crew. First off, I think there needs to be a full audit of the federal government and the state where there's overlapping programs. NEPA is a great example. OSHA is a great example. We are duplicating efforts both on the state and federal level. Second, there won't be the political will to get rid of grants for all grants. So where there's opportunity to block grant, let's block grant that out. In exchange for flexibility, there can be a reduction of funds. So that's 2. Third, rest of the discretionary funds going to states, reduce. We don't need it. And then 4th, there needs to be some regulatory guardrails. In the regulatory process, there is a role for a federalism review that was rolled out by our dear conservative leader Reagan, and then reinforced and reissued by Bill Clinton. That needs to be strengthened. It's been watered down throughout the years. So.
That's good. Sorry, Jen. All right. I'm going to give you the mic. You have the last word.
Oh, I just give a. Hey, Senator Gowan out of Arizona, even though it says Utah here. I'm actually on the border. So I just want to comment back to the previous comment when we were talking about locals compared to state to federal. Reality is, this is my viewpoint of what the Constitution is. The states created the federal government, and the states created the local governments. So really, the state is the local government when you talk about everything. At least that's the way I look at federalism. And at the end of the day, the Constitution is there for powers delegated, given to the federal government only. And then we also have that pesky 9th and 10th Amendment there to try to protect us, but we never use it when we fight in court. However, fighting in court, you're just fighting a battle of the feds, protecting the feds anyway. So, I mean, there's a lot of issues happening that it's a lot more than what we're talking about here. But I just want to comment back on when you're talking, if we say local government, truly the states are your local government. That's what the founders wanted. They wanted us to be the local government so that we can make sure we defend what we believe in our own states, right? If I want to be a Texan, I'll live in Texas. I'm in Arizona. If I want to be a California, I'll live in California. But I'm an Arizonan. So we have 50 states, unlike the rest of the world, where a state is a country, right? We're 50 states that make our country. So I had to throw that out because I had to.
Also, states are not provinces. I mean, another way to
Correct.
think about it is other countries have provinces, and they administer things determined by the central government. That's not our history. Just real quick about the states and localities. Y'all can see that there's a lot of pushback on the notion that the relationship between Washington and the states is comparable or analogous to state and localities. It literally depends on the state. It depends. There are places where the localities predated the state. There are most localities in most states were created by the state. This is a question that, like so many things, depends on where you live, whether you're a Dillon rule or a home rule or other kinds of histories. But that's why America is, the genius of America continues to be at least potentially allowing us to flourish. Different communities, even different states, can have different pathways about the relationship between states and localities. That's something else we can devolve and not have the federal government worry about.
I think that's a fine benediction since we're over time. So thank you all for being here, and we look forward to talking to you more.